Breaking news, Nigeria takes a bold stand against U.S. pressure to accept thousands of deported prisoners. In a fierce response, Nigeria's foreign minister declared the country cannot bear the burden of accepting foreign convicts, especially when it faces its own economic and social challenges. As the U.S. pushes harder, will Nigeria bend, or will it hold firm? The stakes are high, and this could set a precedent for the future of international relations. Don't miss this explosive development. Stay tuned. In a bold move, Nigeria has firmly rejected the United States' request to accept thousands of deported Venezuelan prisoners. The U.S. has been pressuring African nations to shoulder the burden of foreign convicts, but Nigeria, already grappling with its own severe challenges, has made it clear it cannot bear any more weight. Nigeria's foreign minister stated that the country is already facing significant issues, including economic hardships, skyrocketing unemployment, and rising insecurity. The last thing Nigeria needs is to become a dumping ground for prisoners from another nation, especially when it's struggling to manage its own domestic problems. Nigeria, with a population exceeding 230 million people, is already under immense pressure. From poverty and youth unemployment to a lack of proper infrastructure and security threats, the country's resources are already stretched thin. Accepting deported prisoners would only exacerbate these issues. Yet, the U.S. continues to push for Nigeria to accept these convicts, many of whom are reportedly coming straight out of prison. But Nigeria has been clear, its priority must remain the well-being of its own citizens, and it cannot afford to take on more international burdens. The question now is, why is the U.S. making such a request? Why is Nigeria being asked to handle the aftermath of the U.S.'s internal issues? This situation raises critical concerns about the unequal expectations placed on African nations. Historically, Africa has borne the weight of global decisions, often without receiving fair treatment or support. Nigeria's rejection of this request could be a sign of a changing narrative. This bold stance may signal a shift in how African countries are positioning themselves on the global stage. It's clear that this issue goes beyond just a diplomatic disagreement. It speaks to the broader, ongoing struggle for sovereignty and respect. Could this be another example of global double standards where African nations are expected to shoulder the burden of problems created elsewhere? The Nigerian foreign minister's strong words have echoed across the country, with many applauding the government's decision to stand firm. He emphasized that Nigeria already has enough challenges to manage without taking on more international problems. At the same time, this decision has sparked conversations about Africa's place in the world. Will this rejection of the U.S. request encourage other African nations to also stand their ground against Western pressures, or will they continue to be seen as the dumping ground for problems created by other countries? Moreover, the issue of visas has added another layer of tension. The U.S. recently downgraded Nigerian visas to a single-entry, 3-month limit, which some see as a form of retaliation. Nigeria's stance has not only affected diplomatic relations but also fueled resentment among citizens who are tired of being treated as an afterthought in global politics. The broader implications of this situation are significant. As African nations continue to face increasing pressure from global powers, the question of sovereignty becomes more urgent. Can African countries continue to allow external pressures to dictate their decisions, or will they take control of their own futures? Nigeria's rejection of the U.S. demand is not just about deported prisoners, it's about the country's ability to make decisions for itself without foreign interference. It's about reclaiming the power to prioritize domestic well-being over foreign expectations. The global community is watching as Nigeria takes a stand, and the question remains, will this be a turning point for African nations, or is this just the beginning of a larger confrontation over sovereignty and self-determination? Stay tuned for the next part of this unfolding story, where we'll explore the potential consequences of Nigeria's decision on its diplomatic and economic future. As Nigeria stands firm in rejecting the U.S. request to accept deported Venezuelan prisoners, the diplomatic fallout is beginning to unfold. The decision has sent shockwaves across international circles, raising concerns about the implications for Nigeria's relationship with the U.S. and other global powers. While Nigeria's government has made its stance clear, The diplomatic consequences are far-reaching, and the world is closely watching how the situation will evolve. The U.S. pressure on Nigeria to accept thousands of prisoners from Venezuela is seen by many as an unfair burden on a country already grappling with a multitude of internal challenges. Nigeria's rejection is not just a defiance of the U.S., it is a declaration of sovereignty. The Nigerian government has stated that it will not allow its citizens to suffer further from the consequences of foreign policies and decisions made in other parts of the world. This move underscores Nigeria's growing desire to take control of its own future without being subjected to external pressures. The diplomatic implications of this rejection are significant. On the one hand, Nigeria's decision could be seen as a victory for national sovereignty, showing that African nations are no longer willing to accept foreign impositions without questioning their fairness. On the other hand, it could lead to strained relations with the U.S., which has long been a key ally of Nigeria. The U.S. has already downgraded Nigerian visas to a single-entry, 3-month limit, which many see as a retaliatory measure. This could escalate tensions between the two nations, potentially affecting trade, diplomatic dialogue, and cooperation on other international matters. But Nigeria's decision goes beyond just this one request. It is about setting a precedent for how African nations interact with the rest of the world. For years, African countries have been subjected to pressure from Western powers, often being asked to take on the consequences of decisions made outside of their borders. From the exploitation of resources to the imposition of foreign policies, African nations have been forced to accept burdens without receiving the support or respect they deserve. Nigeria's firm stand against the U.S. request is an attempt to shift this dynamic. It is a call for African nations to take their sovereignty seriously and demand respect from the global community. In rejecting the U.S. demand, Nigeria is sending a message to the world that it will no longer accept being a passive player in global politics. This decision could spark a broader movement across Africa, encouraging other nations to follow suit and stand up for their own interests. However, the risks are also high. Strained relations with the U.S. could have significant consequences for Nigeria, especially considering the current global economic landscape. The U.S. is a major trading partner, and any deterioration in diplomatic ties could impact Nigeria's economy, including trade agreements and foreign investments. The question now is whether the Nigerian government is prepared for the long-term effects of this decision. Will Nigeria be able to maintain its sovereignty while balancing its international relationships, or will this decision lead to isolation and further economic challenges? As the situation unfolds, one thing is clear: Nigeria is no longer willing to accept the status quo. The decision to reject the U.S. demand represents a significant turning point in the country's approach to foreign relations. Whether this will lead to a new era of self-determination for African nations or create more challenges for Nigeria remains to be seen. The world is watching closely as Nigeria charts its own course. The implications of this decision will not only affect Nigeria but could also have a ripple effect across the entire African continent. Stay tuned as we continue to follow the fallout of this historic move and examine how other African nations may respond to the growing pressure from Western powers. As Nigeria's rejection of the U.S. request to accept deported Venezuelan prisoners continues to make headlines, the global reaction has been swift and varied. While many in Nigeria and across Africa are applauding the government's bold stance, the implications of this decision extend far beyond just one diplomatic issue. Nigeria's refusal is not only a response to the U.S., it is part of a larger shift in global geopolitics, particularly concerning how African nations are positioning themselves on the world stage. The U.S. has long been a dominant power in international relations, often using its influence to shape policies and decisions in countries around the globe. However, Nigeria's firm refusal to accept the deported prisoners signals a shift in how African nations are handling pressure from global powers. Many believe that African countries have been subjected to the whims of foreign powers for too long, often asked to shoulder the burdens of policies and decisions made far beyond their borders. This situation has highlighted the need for a new paradigm in international relations, one in which African nations assert their sovereignty and stand up for their own interests. But the U.S. is not the only country that may be affected by Nigeria's rejection. Global powers, particularly those with economic and strategic interests in Africa, are closely monitoring the situation to assess how it will impact their relationships with Nigeria and other African countries. Will Nigeria's refusal to comply with the U.S. request encourage other African nations to follow suit and reject similar pressures in the future? Or will this decision lead to increased tensions between African countries and Western powers, creating a new dynamic in international diplomacy? The reaction from the U.S. has been notably sharp. The recent downgrading of Nigerian visas to a single-entry, 3-month limit is seen by many as a direct response to Nigeria's rejection of the deportation request. This diplomatic move is likely to escalate tensions between the two nations, potentially affecting a wide range of areas, from trade to foreign aid. But this conflict also raises deeper questions about the relationship between African nations and the West. Why should African countries bear the weight of decisions made by foreign powers? Why should they be expected to accept foreign prisoners, especially when their own citizens are struggling to meet basic needs? These are questions that are being asked not only in Nigeria but across the African continent. Many believe that this is an opportunity for African countries to assert their independence and demand respect from global powers. The broader implications of Nigeria's rejection are profound. If Nigeria's decision is seen as a sign of defiance against Western pressure, it could spark similar moves from other African nations, leading to a shift in the balance of power in international relations. African countries may begin to push back against the influence of foreign powers, particularly in areas where their sovereignty is being compromised. On the other hand, Nigeria's stance could also have economic consequences. As one of Africa's largest economies, Nigeria's relationship with the U.S. and other global powers is crucial for its growth and development. The country relies on foreign trade, investment, and aid, and any breakdown in diplomatic relations could have a negative impact on its economy. The situation is complex, and Nigeria faces the difficult task of balancing its sovereignty with the need for international cooperation. As the global community watches closely, the outcome of this dispute could have far-reaching consequences for Nigeria and the entire African continent. Will Nigeria's rejection of the U.S. demand mark the beginning of a new era in African diplomacy, or will it lead to more challenges and conflicts on the global stage? Only time will tell. The world is waiting to see how Nigeria navigates this critical moment in its history, and how other African nations will respond to the growing call for sovereignty and independence in the face of foreign pressures. Stay tuned for the next part of this series, where we'll examine the potential long-term effects of Nigeria's decision on the continent and the global community. Nigeria's bold decision to reject the U.S. request to accept deported Venezuelan prisoners is not just a standalone event, it is a reflection of a larger movement sweeping across Africa. As the world watches, Nigeria's refusal is igniting a conversation about the broader struggle for sovereignty and self-determination across the African continent. For too long, African nations have been subjected to pressures from former colonial powers and other global superpowers, often at the expense of their own citizens' well-being. The Nigeria-US standoff is a symbolic moment in Africa's long journey toward reclaiming its independence, both politically and economically. Nigeria's government has made it clear that its priority must be its own citizens. Accepting prisoners from Venezuela, especially when Nigeria is already grappling with an overburdened justice system and a growing population, would be a step backward in their efforts to ensure the safety and prosperity of their own people. Nigeria's refusal is a direct challenge to the status quo, which has often seen African nations forced to take on burdens imposed by foreign powers without consultation or respect for local circumstances. This move by Nigeria is more than just about one diplomatic issue, it is a call for African countries to take control of their own destiny. Many African nations, including Nigeria, are tired of being viewed as the continent of the other. They are demanding respect for their sovereignty and insisting that their voices be heard in the global arena. The question now is whether Nigeria's decision will serve as a blueprint for other African countries to assert their own sovereignty in the face of external pressures. But the road to self-determination is not without its challenges. While Nigeria's rejection of the U.S. demand is seen as a victory for national sovereignty, it also has the potential to strain diplomatic relations with one of the world's most powerful nations. The U.S. has already retaliated by downgrading Nigerian visas, a move that could have significant economic and diplomatic repercussions. However, Nigeria's decision could also be the catalyst for a wider movement across Africa. With a growing sense of unity and purpose, African nations could begin to challenge the dominance of global powers, asserting their rights to make decisions that benefit their people rather than being beholden to the interests of other nations. Nigeria's rejection of the U.S. request is also a stark reminder of the economic challenges that African countries face. The decision comes at a time when Nigeria is grappling with unemployment, poverty, and insecurity. The country's leadership has made it clear that its priorities lie in addressing these issues, and taking on foreign prisoners would be a drain on resources that could be better used to address internal crises. But Nigeria's refusal could also set a dangerous precedent. If other African countries begin rejecting similar requests from foreign powers, there is the potential for greater isolation and tension in international relations. African nations could find themselves at odds with the West, potentially losing access to critical economic support, trade agreements, and diplomatic alliances. This creates a difficult balancing act for African leaders who must weigh the importance of national sovereignty against the need for international cooperation. Nigeria's decision to reject the U.S. request is a powerful statement about the country's desire to control its own future, but the long-term effects of this decision are still uncertain. Will other African nations follow suit, or will Nigeria's isolation lead to unforeseen consequences that impact its economic and diplomatic standing? The world is watching closely, and the outcome of this dispute will likely shape the future of African diplomacy for years to come. Will this moment be remembered as a turning point in Africa's quest for independence, or will it mark a setback in the continent's efforts to secure its own future? Stay tuned as we continue to follow this evolving story and explore the potential consequences of Nigeria's rejection of foreign pressure. As Africa continues to rise, its nations must remain vigilant and united in their fight for sovereignty and self-determination. Nigeria's firm rejection of the U.S. demand to accept deported Venezuelan prisoners has reverberated across the global stage. While the decision marks a significant moment in Nigeria's diplomatic history, it also raises critical questions about the future of Africa's relations with the West and how the continent will navigate its path to true independence. Nigeria's stand is a powerful assertion of its sovereignty, and it could serve as a model for other African nations who are tired of being pushed around by foreign powers. But as much as this decision is seen as a triumph, the road ahead is fraught with challenges. The immediate diplomatic fallout with the U.S. has already begun, with retaliatory actions such as the downgrading of Nigerian visas. The question now is whether these tensions will escalate further or whether they will remain limited to symbolic gestures. The long-term implications of Nigeria's decision are still unfolding, but one thing is clear: the world is watching how Africa responds to foreign pressures. Will Nigeria's stance inspire other African nations to take similar action, or will it isolate Nigeria further from the international community? This is a defining moment in Africa's ongoing struggle for sovereignty. For too long, African countries have been asked to carry the burdens of other nations, often with little to no regard for their own needs. Nigeria's rejection of the U.S. demand challenges this dynamic and could set a precedent for other nations to follow. However, the risk is that this move could lead to increased isolation. As global powers continue to exert influence over the continent, African nations will have to decide whether to prioritize their independence or their relationships with Western nations. For Nigeria, the decision to reject the U.S. request is about more than just deported prisoners. It is about taking control of its future and making it clear that the country will no longer accept the imposition of foreign policies that do not serve its interests. But Nigeria is not alone in this struggle. Across the continent, there are signs that other nations are also pushing back against foreign influence. Whether it's through the rejection of colonial-era currencies, like the decision by the Sahel states to launch their own regional currency, or through efforts to regain control over natural resources, African nations are increasingly looking to assert their sovereignty in ways that challenge the established global order. However, the path to true independence is not an easy one. While the rejection of foreign influence is a crucial step, it must be accompanied by domestic reforms and development. Nigeria's decision may be a symbol of defiance, but it also raises the question of whether the country is prepared to face the long-term economic and political consequences of such a stance. Will Nigeria be able to maintain its sovereignty while continuing to build relationships with key trading partners and securing the foreign investment needed to drive its economy forward? Or will this decision lead to further isolation and economic challenges? This is the balancing act that Nigeria and other African nations must navigate. As the world shifts and global dynamics change, Africa's voice is becoming stronger, but so too is the pressure to maintain strategic alliances. In the coming years, we will likely see more African nations take bold stands against foreign influence, each of them weighing the costs and benefits of sovereignty in an increasingly interconnected world. Nigeria's refusal to accept the deported prisoners is just the beginning of a larger conversation about Africa's future. The question now is whether this moment will be remembered as a turning point in the continent's quest for true independence, or whether it will be seen as a short-lived victory in a much larger struggle. The world's eyes are on Africa, and the decisions made today will shape the continent's future for generations to come. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the broader implications of Nigeria's rejection, the shifting dynamics of Africa's place in the world, and the path forward for African nations in their quest for sovereignty and self-determination.